Good afternoon, everyone. We have gathered here for Interdepartmental Faculty Exchange Program, and today is our second special lecture on the Canterbury Tales and Economic Framework, presented by Dr. Shondeep Sinha, Associate Professor, Department of Commerce. We welcome Sir and we request Sir to come on the podium and start with the lecture.
Thank you, Devarika. At the very outset, I would like to thank all my beloved colleagues of the Department of English, and especially Mr. Dilwar Hussain for inviting me to deliver a lecture on the topic titled The Canterbury Tales and Economic Framework. Now, as we know that The Canterbury Tales was written by Geoffrey Chaucer, who is considered as one of the greatest poets of the Middle Ages, and John Dryden regarded him as the father of English poetry. Now, first of all, we would browse through the important events in Chaucer's life. Now, the date of birth of Chaucer is not certain. Many scholars think that he was born between 1340 to 1345 AD. His father was John Chaucer, a wine merchant, and his mother was Agnes, a witch lady. Now, not much is known about Chaucer's formal education, but it is believed that he learned to read and write at his home, and he was probably taught by one of his father's clerks, and he is assumed to attend a school named St. Paul's Almary Grammar School, which was near to his house. Now, our main focus will be his professions. So, when in his early teens, he became a servant in the royal household. So, he began his career or profession as a servant. Then he joined the army of the king to fight against the French, which was later to be known as the 100 Years of War. He was captured in the war, and the King Edward III secured his release by paying a ransom of 16 pounds. So you can see that from a very early age, he enjoyed royal patronage. Now Chaucer travels to Spain. He becomes a valet, that is a personal attendant, and a squire, that is an attendant of a knight who is likely to become a knight in future. And he also receives a life pension of 20 pounds from the king. He again serves in the army. He travels to Italy on a diplomatic mission. He is then appointed as the controller of customs for exporting and importing wool, hides and skin. His next appointment was that of the Justice of Peace, a judicial position for Kent, a county in England. He then retired from the controllership of customs and became a knight, that is a member of the parliament. Then, after reaching 40, he began to write the Canterbury Tales. His next appointment, that is after the controllership of the customs, he was appointed the clerk of the king's works for overseeing the large construction projects of the royal household. Then he retired from that position also, and he became a deputy forester of the royal forest, which was his last professional position. So you can see that he practiced various professions, and these professions were basically commercial positions. So he had a knack, or he had a learnings of the commercial practices and dealings of the time. So then he writes most of the Canterbury Tales, and he dies on 1400 on 25th of October, and he is the first poet to be buried in the Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey in London. So that was about the Chaucer's economic background of the late medieval period, that is approximately from the middle of the 12th century to the latter part of the 15th century. The important features are this, that during that period, the growth of population led to the growth of old towns and the development of new towns, which were basically modest market towns. So by the 12th and 13th century, many new towns were developed, and as noted by Dyer, the population of town dwellers by 1300 was about 1 million. So this growth in population led to the growth in trade also, and at that time England was a major center. England, being a port island, was a major center of European trade, and it traded with almost all the European countries such as Italy, Poland, France, Spain, Venice, and also Iceland, as you can see here. So England had direct trade routes with most of the European countries of that time. The next important feature of that period was the monetization of the English society. That is, the increase in the circulation of the coins and also the increase in the financial transactions. Now this was linked to the development of trade towns and also to the development of the agricultural growth, the development of specialized commercial projects, and the consciousness of the money's place and function in society that led to the rise of the merchants' position to great social power and political power also. They began to enjoy social and political power. And the habit of calculating in terms of money was also practiced in daily life. Next comes the credit system. Now this is the most important feature of that period, because shortage of cash was not a constraint. Merchants purchased and sold goods on credit. And due to this, they can invest in several businesses at a time, and smaller merchants, they were also able to expand their businesses. So credit freed trade from the shortage of cash, and the merchant community also developed a flexible way of paying their debt. That is, they discounted or assigned their debt to a creditor. For example, suppose Mr. A is my debtor and Mr. B is my creditor. So I will not pay Mr. B any cash. I have to pay Mr. B some amount of money. I will not pay him some money. I will assign my debtor A to pay to B. So this way I don't have to pay any cash to B. This was called the discounting or the assignment of debtors. Also, the recovery of debt was the most important feature, and the merchants, they legalized the instruments of debt in the local courts. So the debt instruments were legally enforceable. So we have to bear these important economic developments in mind. Now Chaucer's London during that period. London was the main center of wool and cloth exporting, being a port town. And with the development of the English banking system, it was also a financial hub of the country. Now Chaucer grew in the midst of this commercial and industrial environment, and from very early childhood he had an experience of this commercial aspect in his life, because his father was a wine merchant. He used to go to the dock, that is the 3 Crane Square, near his house with his father, and he would see the ships coming from France, importing and unloading the wine. And also many famous merchants were members of the London business community. They were foreign merchants. And from them, Chaucer learned French and Italian. So without having any formal education, he learned Latin, French and Italian, which later helped him in his literary production. So that was about the economic framework during that time. Now we go into the Canterbury Tales. Now the Canterbury Tales was written in Middle English, that is the language of England during the later part of the medieval period. And the original title is The Canterbury Tales, or The Tales of Canterbury. It is an epic satirical poem consisting of 19,336 lines, a major portion of which is written in poetic form and a few sections in prose. It is written in the style of heroic couplet, that is pair of rhyming lines A, A, B, B in iambic pentameter. So an iambic is a meter, that is an unstressed or unaccented syllable followed by a stressed or accented syllable. So these two syllables make a meter, and in a single line there were 5 meters, penta means 5. So there were 10 syllables in each line. And it is said that Chaucer invented this metric form of iambic pentameter, which was later followed by Shakespeare. Now, the Canterbury Tales is composed of 10 fragments or groups, and it begins with the general prologue. And most of the tales, they have a prologue of their own. Now, in the general prologue, it is mentioned that during the month of April, the narrator, that is Chaucer himself, he meets a group of 29 pilgrims who are going on a pilgrimage from London to Canterbury, where the shrine of the martyr Saint Thomas Becket is situated. Thomas Becket was killed in about 1170 in Canterbury. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury. So they meet there at Tabard Inn, and the host of the inn, Harry Belly, he suggests that in order to kill the boredom of their journey, each pilgrim, including the narrator, that is Chaucer, that is in total 30 pilgrims, they will tell 2 stories on their way to Canterbury and 2 stories on their return journey back to London. So, the original plan of Chaucer was to write 120 tales, that is 30 into 4. But in his lifetime, he could only finish 24 tales. The host also said that he would judge the best, the storyteller, and he would give a prize, that is in the form of a meal at his inn, and the cost of the meal will be borne by the other pilgrims. So we see that from the very outset, in the general prologue, there is an indication of competition, which is a commercial term. Just like merchants compete to sell their goods in the marketplace, here the pilgrims, they are competing to tell their stories and win a prize, which indicates a financial dimension. As Meyer suggests, to the positioning of the Canterbury Tales within a market economy in which social groups jostle to maintain their position and which the stories themselves become identified as the products of work. So the stories themselves are sellable products. So next we will begin the tales. I will discuss about 4 tales, and I will show the commercial implications of those tales. So let's begin with the knight's tale. A knight now of the 29 pilgrims, they belong to the various professions. There was a knight, a shipman, a franklin, monk, like this. Now in the knight's tale, love and arms are portrayed within a commercial framework. The story is about a romance involving a fight, which is again a competition between two knights, Arcite and Palamon, to win the love of Emily, who is the sister-in-law of the Duke of Athens, Theseus. Now, in the midst of his story, the knight suddenly stops because he recollects that he has forgotten to tell something. He has forgotten to mention the expenditure to be borne by Theseus to build an amphitheater where the fight will be held. So here is an element of cost, commercial aspect involved. Just to quote there, I suppose men would consider it negligence if I forget to tell the expenditure of Theseus, who goes about so busily to build the lists royally that such a noble theatre as it was, I dare well say there was not another such in this world. So Theseus was supposed to build the greatest theatre in the world. And the knight has forgotten to mention the expenditure to be incurred to build the theatre. Earlier in the tale, when Palamon and Arcite are both captured by Theseus, he sends them to prison for life without accepting any ransom, saying that to Athens to dwell in prison perpetually he would not accept any ransom. And in a tower in anguish and in woe, this Palamon and his fellow Arcite forevermore remain. No gold can ransom them. Here gold means money. So we see that ransom is mentioned here. Again, later on, when Theseus frees both of them without any ransom, he says that each one of you shall go where he pleases, freely without ransom or resistance. So with the repeated references to ransom in his tale, Chaucer seems to highlight the existence of commercial values and the possibility of a certain type of exchange, that is exchange of prisoners for money. Now in this tale, Chaucer's personal experience of being released by the king when he was captured by the French army, you can correlate this with Chaucer's own experience. Next is the tale of the shipman. Now this is about rich merchant and his beautiful wife, who spends a substantial amount of money for her social needs, for buying new clothes, expensive clothes. So one day the merchant invites his cousin, a monk, to the house. Now shortly afterwards, the merchant is shown to get busy with his bookkeeping works, his accounting works. He's checking his accounting records in his accounting house behind closed doors to see how much he has spent and what he has gained in his business, whether he has become richer or poorer than before. I will not quote. So here is a mention of bookkeeping, which is also an economic or accounting aspect. Now while the merchant is busy with his bookkeeping work, the wife asks the monk for a loan to repay one of her debts. Since the wife was in the habit of purchasing expensive clothes, she was in debt most of the time. So she asked the monk to lend her some money. A money of 100 francs. The monk, that is Don John, he, without informing the wife, borrows the money from the merchant and pays it to the wife. And the wife, after receiving the loan, agrees to go to bed with him. Later, when Don John the monk meets the merchant, he tells the merchant that he has repaid the debt of the merchant by paying the amount of 100 francs to his wife. The merchant comes home, is very angry with his wife, he reprimands him, The wife says that she has spent the money in buying new clothes. She asks for forgiveness and she says that she will repay the debt of the husband, that is the 100 francs, by going to bed with the husband. So here we see that the merchant is engaged in his bookkeeping work, which is an iconography of merchants and bankers during that time. Now money is seen to be almost exchangeable with sex. The wife is ready to satisfy the sexual desires of the two men as long as they can meet her demand of financial need. Dorigen, due to the absence of her husband, suffers mentally. Her friends try to console her and try to give her company. So they take her for walks to the docks where she watches ships coming in. But she is afraid because near the docks there are some rocks which may sink the ship after crashing. So she is afraid that her husband may die if he comes back. Now Dorigen's friends, they give some garden parties and they invite singers and squares to dance in those parties. So one of these squares is Aurelius. Who was already in love with Dorigen and declares his love for Dorigen. Now Dorigen rejects Aurelius by displaying her faithfulness to her husband, but she meets Aurelius and promises to offer her love to him if Aurelius can manage to remove those rocks from the shores. Aurelius tries but fails, and he is advised to take the help of a law student who is also a magician. The law student asks for 1,000 pounds to clear the rocks. And through magic, he seems to make the rocks disappear for 1 week. Learning this, Dorigen is both happy as well as afraid, because now she has to go to Aurelius and give her body to him as per her promise. So when Arviragus returns home, Dorigen tells him everything, what has happened. But Arviragus, being a noble man, tells her that you should go to Aurelius and submit yourself. Aurelius, acknowledging Arviragus' nobility and insistence of allowing his wife to come to him, frees Dorigen from her promise. The magician student is so moved by Aurelius' story that he also waives off the debt of 1,000 pounds, which was due from Aurelius. So here we see an economic dimension on account of its portrait of characters. So the characters, like real traders, they are engaged in commercial exchanges. So the principle of exchange is involved here. Dorigen sacrifices her honor in exchange for her husband's safety, and she promises to submit her body to Aurelius in exchange for the undertaking of Aurelius to remove the rocks. Aurelius promises the law student to pay 1,000 pounds in exchange for the student's effort to make the rocks disappear. So here the role of the law student is that of a simple businessman. Moreover, in this tale there are also notions of contract and date. There is a contract between Arviragus and his wife Dorigen that demands mutual faithfulness and obedience. There is also a contract between Aurelius and the student by virtue of which the former promises to pay the latter a sum of money so that the latter can get rid of the rocks. And the notion of debt also figures here clearly in Aurelius' propensity to absolve Dorigen of a debt by forgiving and forgetting her promise, and also in the student's decision to waive off the debt of Aurelius. So next comes the prologue to the Wife of Bath's Tale, which I guess is in your syllabus in the second semester. Now the prologue of this tale is more than twice the actual tale. The prologue is about 856 lines, while the actual tale is 408 lines. Now, in the prologue to the Wife of Bath's Tale, the Wife of Bath, here Bath is a place, and the place got its name because at that time there were many Roman baths in that place. So the wife establishes herself as an authority on marriage because she has been married 5 times since the age of 12. And she thinks that she is an institution of marriage. Now she insists that her husband pay their marriage debts as debtors and slaves to her. As I quote, "My husband shall have it both evenings and mornings, when it pleases him to come forth and pay his debt. A husband I will have, I will not resist, who shall be both my debtor and my slave." So she regards her husband as a debtor and a slave, who has to satisfy her sexual desires as well as her demands for money. Now she admits that the first 3 husbands were good because they were old and they were rich and they were submissive. She would make them work hard at night in order to pay their marriage debt. As I quote, "The 3 were good men and rich and old, hardly might they the statue hold to pay the debt, in which they are bound unto me. You know well what I mean of this, by God. So help me God, I laugh when I think, how pitifully at night I made them work." Now referring to her husband's duty towards her, the wife comments on their failure to please her physical desires. The thing that makes her reprimand them and demand that they pay more money for failing to satisfy her sexual desires, in return for the payment of the marriage debt, which she also owes them. As I quote, "Especially in bed they had misfortune, there would I scold and do them no pleasure. I would no longer in the bed abide, if I felt his arm over my side, until he had paid his penalty to me." Now about the last 2 husbands, she mentions that they were bad husbands. Her 4th husband, whom she married when she was still young, was a womanizer, and he had a mistress also. Her 5th husband, whose name she has mentioned as Jankin, was only 20 years old, and she was 40 when they married. And she thought that being a lusty woman, she would be able to handle the youthfulness of her fifth husband. But she was wrong, and she would regret the age difference, because he would not suffer her abuse like her previous husbands. Now the fifth husband, he had a book of wicked wives named as Valerie and Theophraste. And in this book, the stories of the most deceitful wives in the history were mentioned. So one evening, out of frustration, the wife tore 3 pages out of the book, and he also punches his husband in the face, her husband in the face. Now, the husband repays back by striking her on the head, and that is the reason that she is now deaf in one ear. She cries out that she wants to kiss him before she dies, and when he comes over, he hits him again. So after this fight, they finally manage a truce in which he hands over all his meager estate, all his finances, all his money to her, and she acts kindly and lovingly. So, by deceit, she is able to secure, or she is able to obtain all the money of the fifth husband. So the wives, so reference to the commercial aspects, for example, sale and profit of the sexual relationship in marriage, exhibit a woman who abuses love for her own economic pursuits. As I quote, "And therefore this tale I tell to every man, anyone can profit, for everything is for sale. One can lure no hawks with an empty hand. For profit I would endure all his lust." So we see that the wife's experience with her husbands reveals her obsession for economic profit or gains, and this is quite akin to the English merchant's interest in material gains. So it also underlines the pilgrim's consciousness of the commercial activities prevalent in those days. So we can conclude that the prevalent economic notions such as competition, exchange, value, debt, price, profit, money, debtor, creditor, bookkeeping, contract, transaction, marketplace, all these commercial terms or activities, they permeating into the contemporary society. So these terms affect the social relationships and values of the English people during the later medieval period, and these terms, these economic and commercial terms, form a framework for the topics of universal interest, that is love, marriage, honor, obedience, faithfulness, and fulfillment of promise, have been addressed in some of the tales of the pilgrims in the Canterbury Tales. Thank you.
ওটা কাজ করছে এখানে যাই এখানে
Very good afternoon to all, and thanks to Sandeep sir, our gratefulness to him because of such a wonderful presentation that we just found over here, that how the commercial transactions are in a way fulfilling the societal relationships and helping us or helping the readers at this point of time to relocate the Chaucerian society and reformulate or find out how economics, credit system, the exchanges are translated and transliterated among both economic terms and in terms of relationships, in terms of values, in terms of ethics. We thank sir for this beautiful presentation. Thanks sir for this for fulfilling our one of the second special lecture series of the interdepartmental faculty exchange program.
Is there any question or not?
I guess there might be certain questions from our students, and sir is happy to answer all of them.
Well, I'll try because I am not an authority on Chaucer. I am a commerce teacher, but I will try. Yeah.